The Razer Blade 2018 and ASUS Zephyrus M are quite similar in many aspects. Both are thin and powerful gaming laptops, but which should you buy? This comparison will show you the differences between them and help you decide which one to pick. First, let's check the differences in specs. Both laptops have the same Intel i7-8750H 6-core CPU, but the memory configurations are a little different in my units. The Zephyrus that I tested with had 32GB of DDR4 2666 memory, while the Blade had 16GB. This will of course vary based on the specific model you buy, but I don't think this will be much of an issue when we compare gaming benchmarks. Both laptops are running dual-channel memory at the same speed, a more important factor than overall size after the 16GB mark in my opinion. The graphics are also different between the two. The Blade has the Max-Q version of Nvidia's 1070, while the Zephyrus has the regular non-Max-Q 1070. So just based on this, I'm expecting the Zephyrus to perform a little better in games, but we'll see that soon in the benchmarks. These power the 15.6-inch 1080p 144Hz panels, which are in both laptops. For storage, both laptops had a 512GB NVMe SSD in their single M.2 slots. However, the Zephyrus also had a 1TB hard drive, as it has a single 2.5-inch drive bay, while the Razer Blade doesn't have a 2.5-inch drive bay at all. For network connectivity, both also have support for 802.11 AC Wi-Fi and Bluetooth version 5, but neither have Ethernet ports, so if you want one, you'll need to use a dongle. Both laptops are solid aluminium. The lid of the Zephyrus is a brushed metal, while the Blade is matte black, while the interior of both are also matte black. Overall, both look quite nice and sleek. The design of the Blade was perhaps a little more blocky, although neither had any sharp corners or edges. As for size differences, the Blade is a fair bit smaller than the Zephyrus in all dimensions, although they're fairly similar in height. The Zephyrus gets a bit higher once you open the lid, as the bottom panel rises it up to help improve airflow. As for the weight differences, they're fairly close together, but again, the Blade is lighter here as it's smaller. And this doesn't change much when we include the 230W power bricks and cables for charging. As for the I/O, on the left both laptops have the power input, USB 3.1 Type-A ports, 3 on the Zephyrus and 2 on the Blade, and 3.5mm audio combo jack. Otherwise the Zephyrus has its HDMI 2.0 output here. On the right, both have another USB 3.1 Type-A port, USB 3.1 Gen 2 Type-C port with Thunderbolt 3 support, and Kensington lock. Otherwise, the Blade has its HDMI 2.0B output on this side, but also a mini DisplayPort 1.4 output. On the back, the Blade looks all smooth. The air exhaust vents face down towards the bottom, while the Zephyrus has its vents in clear view. The front of both are also quite smooth. Some green status LEDs on the Blade, and ASUS branding on the Zephyrus. Up on the lids, the Zephyrus has a brushed metal finish with the ROG logo on the side, which lights up in red while the laptop is powered on, while the Blade's is matte black with the Razer logo in the center, which lights up in green while running. Underneath, the Blade has traditional air intake vents towards the back, while the Zephyrus is all smooth due to its unique cooling design. The Zephyrus has its 2 speakers under here towards the front corners, while the Blade has its speakers up on top on either side of the keyboard, although they take up quite a bit of space and neither sounded above average. Back on the bottom, the panels can be removed fairly easily. There's a bit more going on with the Zephyrus as you first remove the metal base. This plate gets pushed up by the metal feet in the rear corners when you open the lid of the laptop and forces it upwards, and this is how the fans are able to get air. After removing the first plate, the rest of the base can be removed. Inside we get easy access to the single M.2 slots, 2 memory slots, and Wi-Fi cards. Note that the Zephyrus has a single 2.5-inch drive bay for a hard drive, while there's no room for one in the Blade. The screens of both laptops are also pretty similar. Both are 15.6-inch 1080p panels with a 144Hz refresh rate, although the Zephyrus also has G-Sync while the Blade does not. The Blade uses an LG IPS panel, while the Zephyrus has an AUO AHVA panel. The Blade has a much thinner bezel too, just 4.9mm thin, while the one on the Zephyrus is noticeably thicker. But despite this, both still have the camera up top, and the quality was slightly better on the Blade. I've measured color gamuts using the Spider 5 Pro. The results were very close together, but the Zephyrus was just slightly ahead here. The brightness of the Blade was only just slightly higher, while the Zephyrus was slightly ahead in contrast ratio. Overall, quite similar though. I'd happily use either for gaming or content creation, no problem. As for backlight bleed, the Zephyrus looked pretty good, just some minor imperfections under this worst case test. The results from the Blade appear to be much worse. But to my own eyes, it was actually difficult to see this even in the dark. I couldn't notice it under normal conditions anyway, but this will of course vary between laptops. Screen flex was minimal with both laptops due to the metal build, although the Blade was a bit more solid, as the hinge is basically most the length of the screen, while the Zephyrus just has small hinges towards the corners. Both keyboards had RGB backlighting available, however the lighting on the Zephyrus is controlled in 4 separate zones, while the Blade has individual key backlighting, giving it more lighting effects and customization options. There was no numpad on the Blade 2, which I personally prefer as I don't use it, and it allows the keyboard to be centered. I had no problems typing with either keyboard, although I didn't really like the smaller arrow keys on the Zephyrus. There wasn't much flex with either keyboard while pushing down hard. A little more with the Zephyrus, as the Blade has that solid metal unibody. The touchpad in both laptops were very nice to use. Both used precision drivers and were extremely smooth to the touch. The touchpad on the Blade was quite large compared to the smaller one on the Zephyrus, which I found preferable. As for the batteries, the 80 watt-hour battery in the Blade was quite a bit bigger than the 55 watt-hour battery of the Zephyrus. It's also important to note that having G-Sync enabled on the Zephyrus will cause the Nvidia discrete graphics to be in use all of the time. So outside of gaming, this will result in less battery life, as it uses more power to run compared to the Intel integrated graphics. It is possible to turn G-Sync off through the software, but this requires a reboot, which can be annoying, but as shown will boost battery life. There's no real difference in gaming with or without G-Sync, as the Nvidia graphics are in use the entire time anyway. Either way, the larger battery in the Razer Blade is lasting quite a bit longer, likely helped by the Max-Q graphics, which will use less power. Thermal testing was completed with an ambient room temperature of 18 degrees Celsius. It was winter while testing was completed, so expect warmer temperatures in a warmer environment. It's also worth noting, with the Blade, gaming mode was enabled, which boosts the clock speeds a little, as realistically, if you're gaming on it, I think you'd be using this mode. Starting down the bottom of the graph, the idle CPU and GPU temperatures in green and blue were quite a bit warmer on the Blade. Moving up into the gaming tests, which were tested with PUBG at high settings, the Blade was again hotter, and both dropped quite a bit with the fans maxed out and CPUs undervolted. The Blade had a -0.140 volt undervolt applied, while the Zephyrus had a -0.090 volt undervolt applied. These were the best I could get, and the results will vary between each CPU. Stress testing was run with AIDA64 and the Heaven benchmark run at the same time in order to try and fully utilize both the processor and graphics. Starting with the purple bars, the Zephyrus was again slightly cooler, and the graphics were significantly cooler here, shown in dark blue. Interestingly, the CPU temperatures increased, shown by the black bar, with the CPU undervolt applied, I suppose because this boosted the clock speed so more was being done. It's worth noting that the graphics in my Blade were basically maxing out at 90 degrees Celsius in most of my testing. From what I've seen in other reviews, this isn't always the case, so my unit may have just had poor contact between the heatsink and GPU die. These are the average clock speeds for the same tests just shown. In general, we can see that the Zephyrus is coming out ahead of the Blade in both CPU and GPU clock speeds for a couple of reasons. Firstly, as shown, it's running cooler, but secondly, I also didn't have CPU power limit throttling present with the Zephyrus, whereas I did in the Blade. Here are the average CPU clock speeds, while under a CPU-only load. Again, no change in the Zephyrus with or without undervolting, and we're able to reach the full 3.9 GHz all-core turbo speed of the 8750H CPU. However, in the Blade that wasn't possible, even with the undervolt applied, due to power limit throttling. To try and demonstrate this practically, here's how both laptops scored in Cinebench, a CPU benchmark. Again, as there's no throttling with the Zephyrus in this test, it's getting full scores, whereas the Blade is a fair bit behind its stock, but it can almost catch up while undervolted. Here are the average GPU clock speeds while under a graphical-only workload. There's not much difference with the Blade, as the stock speed is with it using its gaming mode. Either way, the results of the 1070 in the Zephyrus are a fair bit higher than the Max-Q graphics in the Blade. As for the external temperatures we'll actually be touching, the Blade was a little warmer, almost getting to 40 degrees Celsius, while the Zephyrus was in the low 30s. In these tests, you'll want to look at the number readouts rather than the colours, as different temperature scales were used. While gaming, the Blade went into the mid-50s in the centre and was warm to the touch, while the Zephyrus was in the mid-40s, and both had cooler spots right on the WASD keys. And then fairly similar results with both laptops under CPU and GPU stress tests. As for the fan noise produced by the laptops, I'll let you have a listen to some of these tests. At idle, the Blade was louder, while the fans in the Zephyrus were pretty much silent. While gaming, the Blade was again a fair bit louder, and then with the stress tests running, they were closer together. With the fans maxed out, the Zephyrus was slightly louder, though as we saw, it also ran quite a bit cooler. Finally, let's take a look at some gaming benchmarks. All games will run at 1080p, the native resolution of the displays. Keep in mind that the Zephyrus has Nvidia 1070 graphics, while the Blade uses the 1070 Max-Q, so we're expecting the Zephyrus to come out slightly ahead in all tests. Also again remember, the Blade has gaming mode enabled in all tests, which overclocks it a little. Fortnite was tested before I started using the replay feature, so there may be some slight variance between each test run, although I was in the same area attempting to do the same things. In any case, the Zephyrus is ahead of the Blade, performing 17% better at max settings for the average FPS. CSGO was tested with the Uletical benchmark, and with all settings maxed out, the Zephyrus was around 22% ahead of the Blade in terms of average frame rate, and 13% better in terms of 1% low, although we're seeing high frame rates with either laptop. Overwatch was tested playing with the bots, and although the Zephyrus was ahead for the most part in terms of averages, it was slightly behind when it came to 1% lows at almost all setting levels. But again, the game played very well with either laptop, regardless of setting. PUBG was tested using the replay feature. There wasn't that much of a difference at higher settings between the two in terms of averages. The Zephyrus was just 6% better at ultra settings, while the Blade was ahead in everything at medium or below. Rainbow Six Siege was tested using the built-in benchmark. The Zephyrus was just a little ahead of the Blade in all tests in this title, performing 7% better at ultra settings. Assassin's Creed Origins was also tested with the built-in benchmark. Once more, the Zephyrus is ahead in all tests, although just a small 2% improvement to the average frame rates at max settings. But perhaps more importantly, a 14% improvement to the 1% low, and the Zephyrus pulls out further ahead at lower settings. Far Cry 5 was again tested with the built-in benchmark, and again the Zephyrus is out in front with the gap widening at the lower setting levels. At ultra settings, it's averaging just 5% better than the Razer Blade. Dota 2 was tested using an intense replay. Note that this benchmark does not represent real-world gameplay. You'll see higher performance while actually playing a game. It's meant to represent a worst-case scenario. And at max settings, the Zephyrus was just 6% ahead of the Blade. In Rise of the Tomb Raider, with the built-in benchmark, the Zephyrus was 13% ahead at max settings. Unfortunately, the newer Shadow of the Tomb Raider wasn't out yet when I had these laptops for testing. But in any case, both were performing quite well in this game. Shadow of War was also tested by running the game's built-in benchmark, and surprise surprise, the Zephyrus is coming out ahead again, just 9% better at ultra settings compared to the Blade. Ghost Recon is a fairly resource-intensive game, and both laptops performed pretty similarly here, trading blows with each other depending on the setting level in use. And at ultra settings, the Zephyrus was just 3% ahead of the Blade. Watch Dogs 2 was another demanding game. At ultra settings though, there was almost no difference to the averages, while the 1% low was a little behind. Battlefield 1 was tested during the first campaign mission. For the most part, the Zephyrus is ahead, although in terms of average FPS at ultra settings, it was just slightly behind, although very close. Pretty much margin of error territory, although the 1% lows are 11% ahead here. The Witcher 3 gave me the strangest results out of all games tested. The Blade was actually winning by quite a substantial amount at all setting levels, other than when fully maxed out at Ultra. Not sure why that was the case. Ashes of the Singularity was tested using the built-in benchmark, and again the Zephyrus was out in front at all setting levels, giving us a fairly large 17% improvement at max settings. Overall, both laptops are performing quite well in all games. Realistically, they're both great gaming laptops, but as we've seen, the Zephyrus was on average better. This graph shows how much percent the Zephyrus is ahead of the Blade in each game with the settings maxed out. Almost 8% better on average based on the games I've tested, but it will vary between games. We'll just quickly look at the hard drive speeds, as this may be irrelevant as both laptops are available with different drive configurations. Either way, they both support NVMe PCIe storage. Faster reads for the Zephyrus, but faster writes for the Blade. Here are the results from the 1TB 5400 RPM hard drive in the Zephyrus. Again, it's worth noting the Blade doesn't have a 2.5-inch drive bay, so you've only got the single M.2 slot for storage. Now, perhaps the most important difference, the price. This will change over time, so check out the links in the description for up-to-date pricing. At the time of recording though, with comparable specs, the Razer Blade is around $200 more expensive than the ASUS Zephyrus. This is with the most apples-to-apples specs possible too. both with 256GB SSDs and 16GB of memory, although the Zephyrus does also have a 1TB hard drive. Between the two laptops, I'm personally leaning towards the ASUS Zephyrus. It's got a better graphics card, giving it an edge in games, and despite this, it's still a little cheaper when compared with the Razer Blade. The Zephyrus also has better cooling due to its custom cooling solution, where the base lifts the body up, and it also didn't have any power limit throttling on the CPU like the Blade did. The Zephyrus also has room for a 2.5-inch drive bay, while the Blade does not. Sure, the Blade is a little smaller, thinner, and looks nicer with those trim bezels, but in terms of performance, it's not quite as good for more money. It's only really coming out ahead when it comes to battery life. So which of these two laptops would you guys pick? The Razer Blade or ASUS Zephyrus? Let me know what you guys thought down in the comments, and let me know what other laptops you want to see compared, as this video was made due to a high number of requests. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to subscribe for future comparisons and tech reviews like this one.